In 1979, I was living on my savings from working on the railroad in Minnesota and was living in the highlands of Costa Rica. After a few months of living in San Jose, the capital, filled with diesel fumes and lots of people and heat, I migrated up into the mountains to a little place called Monteverde, a community of North American Quakers who had settled there around 1950 because Costa Rica at the time, and still, was the only country that didn't have an army in the entirety of the Northern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, world. They were tired of militarism in the USA. The young men were about 20 years old at the time. A number of them had spent time in prison back in the States. There were about 10 or 12 of these settlers, one older couple, meaning they were about 50 years old, and then the others were all around 20. And they were all farmers and conservative Quakers from Alabama and Iowa. They found their way to Costa Rica, went up into the mountains with mule teams at first, and then four-wheel drive jeeps eventually on a very rugged, rough road, and developed a dairy community there with a cheese-making plant. That's what they survived on. Anyway, I was living there in 1979. This story has to do with two things primarily. Not so much pacifism or Quakers, but that I had a sore tooth and needed to visit a dentist in San Jose, which was 5 hours away by bus from Monteverde. And the other thing that enters into the story is bird watching. I was not a bird watcher myself. Never have been in particular. But it turns out that these Quakers who settled in Monteverde had been very forward-looking people. In 1950 even, the early 50s, they set aside a large tract of land to be a nature reserve. It's in an interesting place, Monteverde. It's just down from the Continental Divide on the Pacific side. But up at the divide is this cloud forest, so-called, because you're up in the clouds. It's not a rainforest exactly. It's a different ecosystem, but it's very rich and lush and filled with all sorts of tropical birds, exotic birds. And it's one of the very best places for bird watchers to go worldwide. I lived for a few months in the pension run by Susie and Bob. I lived there 3 or 4 months. And these bird watchers would come around, and I was so amused when we'd be sitting there having a meal, because we ate communally, and one side of the table faced outdoors toward this long hibiscus hedge, maybe 40 feet away from the table. And when various hummingbirds would arrive to feed at the hibiscus plants, whoop, up would go the binoculars on all these bird watchers in a row on that side of the table. Whoop, choreographed. Up they went. They needed binoculars to watch 40 feet away. You could see it just with your eyes if you looked, but they needed to see them extra up close to identify them and put them on their list. A bird watcher's list is of paramount importance to a serious globe-trotting birdwatcher. In the competition to see who could compile the longest list with the most sorts of birds on it, who in a calendar year could get the highest variety of birds. A number of these people ended up their year, their last 72 hours of this year, that was all carefully plotted out, in Monteverde. They would end up there because they knew they could get a great many types of birds there. Not so much in the cloud forest itself, but in the pastures, the dairy pastures, just in from the cloud forest. In the cloud forest, you couldn't see much. The vegetation was so thick, you could hear lots of birds, but you couldn't really see them clearly. And to be a conscientious bird watcher and put a kind of bird on your list in good faith, you had to identify it in this, that, and the other way. Sound, sight, there were all sorts of rules for these lists of theirs. So they had to see a bird clearly through their binoculars. Fence lines and pastures right up beside the cloud forest were one of the best places to see birds. The most famous bird in the area, in fact, the most famous in all of Central America, was the quetzal, the resplendent green quetzal. Was it the national bird of Guatemala? I think maybe so. Is the Guatemala currency in quetzals? I think so. Aztecs, those many years ago, the original inhabitants of the area, had so respected the quetzal with the long tail feather, the male, that would come way down from the body of the bird. It could be as long as 2 feet long, the whole shebang of this bird, the quetzal. They considered it sacred, quetzal, and it was a capital offense to kill this bird. The quetzal was way at the top of the wish list of bird watchers. I don't think various categories awarded a bird watcher extra points necessarily, but it was a matter of pride to have spotted a quetzal. And there were people who had lived in Monteverde for years and had never seen a quetzal. When my tooth was hurting and I had to go off to San Jose on the early morning bus, I was in a bad mood and I didn't care if I ever saw a quetzal or not. By this time I was living in Stella Wallace's studio, as everyone called it, her studio in the pasture. She had a former chicken coop that was a residence for one person. I was living in her former painting studio, which her husband had built for her, from preemptive guilt before he ran off with another woman. But Stella didn't want her painting studio after she realized that Kenny had only built it for her because he was about to run off with Phyllis. And so she decided, the hell with it, I'll paint in my house like I've always done. Someone will pay me rent for it, and that'll be fine. I'm not going to work in that place that he put the curse on. So I was living in Stella's studio, which was a very nice little hut. It was one of my favorite residences I've lived in all my life. It had electricity most of the time. It would go out now and then. And it did have a shower inside. It had its own bathroom. It was very sophisticated, this place. Not big, but very nice. There were no screens on the windows because there were no mosquitoes in Monteverde. There were no poisonous snakes up there in the mountains. It was a paradisical place, if there is such a word. It had a beautiful view, this little shack, of banana trees, and way off in the distance, you could make out the Gulf of Nicoya and the Pacific Ocean. Maybe 40, 50 miles away. Paradise. Meditative cows as my neighbors, munching nearby. Garden of Eden. Except my tooth hurt. I'm not sure which tooth it was that hurt. I asked around in Monteverde where I could find the cheapest dentist in San Jose. I went to him. First I had to ride 5 hours in this dusty old school bus. American school bus, like we used to ride in when we were kids here in the States. But at the Rio Lagartos stop on the International Highway, you transferred to a much bigger, somewhat more sleek vehicle, which carried you on up to the plateau city of San Jose. And I went to this dentist. I don't think he had a nurse. I think he did it all himself. And he was an odd character. For one thing, his hands smelled like he had just been smoking a cigar. His fingers grubbing around in my mouth. He did an x-ray. He drilled. He had an electric drill. It wasn't a foot-pumped potter's wheel drill. It went at speed. He did poke around to give me some Novocaine, and maybe he missed the nerve once and had to try again, but he got it done eventually. My whole face was numb, and he did the drilling, put this silver amalgam in the bad tooth, and the next day I took another bus back up the hill to Monteverde. Meantime, I had done a little shopping in town, gotten a few things, gone to a pharmacy, whatever was on my list I took back with me. And I got back to Monteverde, and I was having dinner with the Guindon family because they were very nice, a large extended family. They had something like 7 children, 8 children. Wonderful people. They took pity on me, a young bachelor there, and invited me to join the family Sundays for supper. Sunday was a very sociable day. People went to meeting in the morning, and then sometimes there was a potluck once a month at the schoolhouse, which was also the meeting hall. So they invited me and this other lonesome bachelor, Tom Dixon, up to their house every Sunday for popcorn and soup, or sometimes tamales. We'd sit around, we'd play ping pong. They had a big ping pong table in the middle of the living room. The next Sunday, after I got back from San Jose with my tooth fixed, I was telling them about this dentist, Dr. So-and-so. He didn't speak English. I had to explain to him in my very broken, rudimentary Spanish where it hurt, and that wasn't hard. I just pointed with my finger, which did not smell like cigars, to the place, and then he did the x-ray, and he found it and excavated. So I was telling the Guindons about his fingers smelling like cigars, and Melody, their youngest daughter, who was maybe 11 or 12 at the time, she said, "Ooh, was he smoking? Did he have the cigar in his mouth?" I said, "No, it wasn't that bad. It was just that his fingers smelled a little bad. You know, that's what you get for going to the cheapest dentist in Central America, or at least in San Jose, Costa Rica. But my tooth is fixed now, so it's all right." Except that it wasn't really, because as a special treat, they had something that night that was something homemade, like taffy or something. And I was enjoying my piece of taffy until my filling came out of my mouth with this sticky candy. The filling I'd had in my mouth for maybe 3 days. Tooth filled by the cheapest dentist in San Jose. I felt it come out. I retrieved it. I looked at it. I showed it to the Guindons. They were sympathetic and highly amused that my cheapness had not worked out so well for me. I was kind of amused myself, except it's a long bus ride down to San Jose. I didn't have a lot of disposable income. No income. I had savings. So now I was determined not to go back to my man who had done this first operation, the cigar man. I was going to change my strategy, and instead of going to the cheapest dentist, I was going to go to the most expensive dentist this time and get it done right. I asked around among Monteverde's more prosperous citizens and learned that the dentist I wanted was Dr. Jaime Feinzig. This man was the softest-fingered, cleanest-smelling dentist I've ever been to in my life. A wonderful man. He had a way of giving you the injection, of putting the needle in, that you didn't even feel. He explained when I asked him about it, when I admired his style. He said, "Yeah, I yank the cheek just a little, just as I'm breaking the surface with the needle. I get it aimed just right, and then I yank it, and people are surprised and they don't feel a thing. They're a little distracted." Jaime Feinzig was a very good dentist. But I left out the most important part of when I went to Jaime Feinzig. This appointment that was maybe 2 weeks after the first appointment. Because from Stella's studio, my residence, to get to where the bus started its run at 6 in the morning at the cheese factory, I had to traverse the hillside across to the cheese plant. It was a trail, a path that wended its way. It didn't go down or up very much. It mostly went around and through a gully. And there was this one area where you went around a little rounded spot and over a slight bridge, over a stream. And the trail was cut into the hillside right there. And in the middle of this curve was an old tree that fruited once every 11 years. So they told me. It seemed unlikely, but that was the story. Every 11 years, this tree would fruit, and they said this fruit was the favorite food of the iridescent, resplendent green quetzal. Yes, indeed. National bird of Guatemala, and a pretty highly respected bird in Costa Rica as well, especially among these bird watchers. Well, this happened to be the year the tree was fruiting. It had been 10 years since the previous 11 years ago time. It was currently fruiting. That was the story that was given out. But I was skeptical about this whole thing. That a tree fruited only every 11 years. I had a feeling my leg was being pulled when I was told this. There were a few wise guys in Monteverde. They were pacifists. They were very good people. They were against war, as I was. But they liked to pull your leg now and then. And the idea that this tree that I went by nearly every day, going one place or another, would be the favorite feeding spot of the quetzal, struck me as something that I was being fed myself to test my gullibility, to see if I would sit on this little carved out bench type area right there that was facing this tree, 20 feet from the path. So on the day I had to go back to San Jose to get my tooth refilled by this dentist, Jaime Feinzig, who did not smoke cigars, I hoped. I wasn't in a good mood when I was walking across at 5:45. The dawn had broken. The sun hadn't quite come up. It always came up right about 6 a.m., always set right about 6 p.m. because we were not far from the equator here. We were just a little north. Anyway, it was quite light out. I don't like mornings. I don't like getting up early in the morning. That's one reason I'm not a bird watcher, maybe. So I was in a bad mood. I was going to spend more money at this best dentist in San Jose. I felt my savings draining away. I was going to have to make this round trip by bus, which wasn't pleasant. I'd already bought the items that I needed in San Jose. I didn't need anything more. I was going to have to pay for a pension for a couple nights while I was there, this sort of stuff. In a bad mood. As I was walking across from my little hut, Stella's studio, to the cheese plant, it was maybe a half-mile walk across. Very nice morning, I suppose, but not to me. And as I walked around this rounded area on the path, I was astounded to find that there was a bird watcher sitting there. A young guy in his late 20s, early 30s, with his requisite binoculars, and he was looking through his binoculars steadfastly at this tree. 30 feet away. And I walked past him. I was looking down at the trail as I walked past him. And I said under my breath in a grouchy voice, I said, "Well, you seen any lately?" He said, "Shut up, I'm looking at him right now." And so, since I had been told that this bird watcher was looking at him right then, I stopped my forward motion, stopped looking down at the trail, which is where I had my eyes trained, and I looked around to my right at this tree that fruited once every 11 years. And there in front of me was a resplendent green quetzal, indeed, iridescent, with this long tail coming down, kind of attached from the base of its spine, as if it was a bird's coccyx, that spot where, if we were still monkeys, we would have our tails. Maybe we have a little vestigial bump there, some of us still. But this quetzal had nothing vestigial at all. It had this long tail feather coming down from that spot on its butt. And what I hadn't realized, looking at photos of quetzals in bird books and magazines, was that the tail feather is hinged there, where it attaches to the body. And as the bird sits there feeding on this fruit that comes every 11 years, in the light breeze, the tail feather wafted up and down in this wonderful motion. And I'd never considered that such a thing was possible. Never thought about it. Why would you? In photos of quetzals, it looked fixed, was frozen. But in real life, the tail feather floated up and down. And as it floated up and down, as it moved, the colors changed because it was iridescent. And these colors that you wouldn't think could be found in nature, these electric greens and blues, and especially different shades of green and kind of yellow, they all flashed in a fine array of color in the early morning light. I stood there watching the quetzal. Didn't say any more to the bird watcher. I was out of his way. He was in a state of high excitement because it was one of his life's ambitions to see an iridescent quetzal. It had never been one of my high ambitions. But here, as this trick of fate and great joke on all these bird watchers I'd lived with in the pension, who were desperate to see a quetzal, desperate. They'd flown by private jet, some of them, on this last few days of their quest, and hoping against all hope to see a quetzal in Central America. And here I had just lunked into it because I'd asked the bird watcher. Otherwise, I would have stumped right past the quetzal munching its fruit and would never have seen it. If I hadn't made my dry remark, "Seen any lately?" I wouldn't have seen a quetzal myself. So I left the bird watcher and the quetzal where they were and padded quietly away on the path because I didn't want to miss my bus. I had an appointment with this Dr. Feinsig. And I rode down the hill and around and got on the international highway and made the hair-raising ride to San Jose because the bus drivers had a code of conduct all their own, and they passed in places where you wouldn't have guessed any bus would pass a big truck or a car or any other such thing. You had to kind of close your eyes from time to time. But it was a good bus ride, as bus rides went. No one was throwing up that time. It was good. There's a little dust blowing in the windows, but I had seen a Quetzal that day, which I wouldn't have seen if not for that dentist who smoked cigars, who did such a bad job that his filling fell out the first time I chewed something rather suspect. So that I had to go to the best dentist in San Jose, not the worst. The resplendent green Quetzal. I've seen one, and it was eating fruit, and I think that tooth is still in my mouth, but I could be wrong. I've had a fair amount of dental work done since then.